Most people know where civilization starts. You've heard the story. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, Sumer cuneiform tablets and city-states and kings with long names carved into stone, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Code of Hammurabi. We point to these things and say, here, this is where it began. And in a very specific sense, that's true. Sumer gave us writing, which is why we can point to it at all. But here's the thing nobody really talks about. Writing wasn't the beginning of civilization. It was just the beginning of civilization leaving notes. Before the Sumerians put stylus to clay, before the first cuneiform sign was ever pressed, there were people already living in cities, or something close enough to cities that the difference is mostly academic. They were building temples on raised platforms. They were digging canals through floodplains to move water where they needed it. They were trading goods across hundreds of miles of ancient landscape. They were doing, in other words, exactly the things we associate with civilization, just without anyone writing it down in a way that survived to tell us their names. That's what this story's about. Not a hidden empire, not a secret super-civilization scrubbed from the record by enemies or floods or time. Something quieter and in some ways stranger than that. A chapter of human history that exists almost entirely in mud and archaeology, in the shape of foundations buried under later foundations, in the chemistry of ancient soil, in the distribution of a particular style of painted pottery that shows up from southern Iraq all the way to the Persian Gulf and beyond. The people who made these things left us almost no words, so we have to read what they left us instead, and what they left us is remarkable. History didn't forget them the way you forget a name. It forgot them the way you forget to mention the foundation when you describe a house. The house is still standing on it. Everything that came after, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, the whole sweep of Mesopotamian civilization. It's all sitting directly on top of what these earlier people built, both physically and culturally. The mud brick under the mud brick, the city under the city. What we're going to trace tonight is how that happened. How communities in the marshlands and river deltas of ancient Mesopotamia gradually developed into something that looks unmistakably urban. We'll move through the places where archaeologists have dug down past Sumerian layers and found something older underneath. Places like Eridu, which the Sumerians themselves remembered as the first city ever built, though they couldn't have known exactly how right they were. Places like Tel el-Weli, a site so deep in the archaeological sequence it sits below anything that has writing near it. We'll talk about the slow, patient work of irrigation, how moving water through a dry landscape isn't just engineering, it's a political act, a social commitment, a reason to stay in one place and organize your neighbors. We'll look at the temple platforms, those raised mud brick structures that appear again and again across the region, and ask what they meant to the people who built them, how they might have functioned not just as religious architecture, but as the organizational center of something that looks a lot like an early economy. We'll think about what it means when craft specialists start to appear in the archaeological record, when certain people start making things that other people can't, when that division starts to show up in where people are buried and how. And we'll sit with the problem that makes all of this harder than it sounds. We don't really know what to call these people. The term most archaeologists use is Ubaid, which is the name of a site near Ur where this particular culture was first formally identified. But that's a modern label for a material pattern, not a name these people ever use for themselves. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't know how they understood their own identity. We're naming them the way you'd name a colour because it helps us talk about it, not because the colour named itself. So tonight we're going to spend some time in that uncertainty, in the space between what we know and what we can only infer, between what the soil tells us and what the silence doesn't. It's a different kind of history, slower and less dramatic than kings and battles, but in some ways more profound. Because these were the people who figured out how to make settled life in a difficult landscape not just possible but worth doing. Everything that came after grew from the roots they put down, Before we go any further, if you're listening to this on Spotify, thank you. Following the channel there and listening through Spotify is one of the most direct ways you can support what I'm doing, and the audio there is ad-free and music-free, which makes it easier to drift. The link is in the description if you want to switch over. And I want to ask you something, because I genuinely find this interesting. Where are you right now, and what time is it where you are? It's one of those things that still surprises me every time I look at the comments. Someone in Auckland just finishing their morning coffee, someone in Stockholm already in bed, someone in Lagos in the middle of the afternoon with nowhere better to be than here, thinking about people who lived 6,000 years ago in a landscape that no longer exists. I check those comments. I read them. There's something about knowing the geography of who's listening that feels right for a channel about where we all came from. So drop it in the comments. City, country, time of day, whatever you feel like sharing, and then settle in. Because we're going back a long way, further than Sumer, further than the first written word, to the moment before history remembered to write anything down. So when we say before Sumer, what do we actually mean? Because history doesn't divide itself into clean chapters the way textbooks do. There isn't a moment where someone flipped a switch and civilization began. The timeline is messier than that, and more interesting. Let's orient ourselves. The period we're talking about stretches roughly from the late Neolithic, somewhere around 6,500 BCE, through what archaeologists call the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age, and into a long stretch of time labelled the Ubaid period, which runs from approximately 6,500 to 3,800 BCE. After that comes the Uruk period, when southern Mesopotamian settlements grew dramatically in size and complexity. And then, emerging out of that, comes what we recognise as Sumer, with its early dynastic city-states, its kings, its temples, its writing. That's roughly the 3rd millennium BCE. So we're talking about something like 3,000 years of human history before the part that most people think of as the beginning. That gap matters. 3,000 years is longer than the entire span from the Roman Empire to today. What happened in it wasn't nothing. But here's why Sumer looks like a beginning. Writing. That's the honest answer. When cuneiform script emerges in southern Mesopotamia around 3,100 BCE, suddenly we have something that survives in a legible form, that can be translated, quoted and cited. We have the Sumerian king lists with their absurdly long reigns, kings who supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years before the flood, and then more recognizable figures afterward. We have administrative tablets recording grain deliveries and livestock counts. We have foundation texts, dedicatory inscriptions, eventually mythology and poetry. The archaeological record transforms from a collection of objects and structures that we have to interpret into something that interprets itself, at least partially. That shift is so dramatic that it feels like an origin, like the world suddenly acquiring a voice where before there was only silence. But that's a problem of evidence, not a fact about history. The writing didn't create the civilization. It documented one that was already deeply developed. The Ubaid period is where the real story starts, and the most important thing to understand about it is that it wasn't an event. It was a process, a long, gradual, mostly unspectacular accumulation of decisions made by people who are figuring out how to live in a challenging landscape and slowly getting better at it. Communities forming around water sources in the southern alluvial plain, small settlements becoming slightly less small, people returning to the same places generation after generation, building on top of what came before, literally and culturally. There's no Ubaid revolution the way we sometimes talk about a Neolithic revolution. There's just time and adaptation and slow change adding up. That leads us to the core question this whole story is built around. Did Sumer invent city life, or did it inherit and intensify systems that were already there? The archaeological evidence is pretty clear that Sumer didn't invent it. When excavators at sites like Eridu dug down through the Sumerian layers and kept going, they found older temples underneath, and older ones under those, and older ones still. The earliest levels at Eridu predate Sumer by millennia. The settlement pattern, the architectural logic of a temple at the center of community life, the practice of rebuilding on top of sacred ground rather than abandoning it, all of that was already established long before the first cuneiform sign. What Sumer did was inherit those systems, expand them dramatically, and add the administrative technology of writing, which is why Sumer got remembered, and everything underneath it mostly didn't. So the question becomes, what exactly did those earlier people build, and how do we know anything about it at all, given that they left us no text? This is where archaeology has to do the work that history can't, and the toolkit is specific. Potsherds first, because ceramics are almost indestructible and they carry information about technology, trade, and cultural contact. The Ubaid period is actually defined by a distinctive style of painted pottery, dark geometric designs on buff or greenish clay, and the fact that this pottery shows up across an enormous geographic range tells us something significant about the connections between communities during this period. It isn't just decoration, it's evidence of shared practices, shared networks, possibly shared beliefs, then architecture, the shape of foundations, the orientation of buildings, the presence of raised platforms, the size and organization of rooms. These things tell us about how people organized their social space, which tells us something about how they organize their social life. When the same architectural grammar repeats across multiple sites separated by hundreds of miles, that's not coincidence. It's pattern, and pattern requires explanation. Burials. The way people bury their dead is one of the most reliable proxies we have for social organization, because mortuary practice tends to reflect how a community understood hierarchy, kinship, and the relationship between the living and the dead. When grave goods start appearing in greater quantities with certain individuals, when some burials are more elaborate than others, you're looking at the material signature of social differentiation. Someone is deciding who matters more. That decision didn't begin with the Sumerians, and environmental proxies, pollen records, sediment cores, isotope analysis of ancient soils. These tell us what the landscape looked like when floods came, when droughts hit, when the marsh expanded or contracted. The southern Mesopotamian floodplain was not a stable environment. It was dynamic, difficult, and demanding. Understanding how people managed it, or failed to manage it, requires understanding what it was actually doing at any given time. What these sources cannot tell us is everything we most want to know. They can't tell us what these people called themselves. They can't tell us what language they spoke, though there are theories about that we'll come back to. They can't tell us what their myths were, how they understood the world, what they prayed for when they climbed those temple platforms and stood above the flat plain, looking out across the reed marshes. That silence is real, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. But the absence of words doesn't mean the absence of complexity. It means we have to read the world they left rather than the words. And when you learn to read it, what you find is not emptiness before Sumer. What you find is depth. To understand what those earlier people built, we have to start with the ground it all rested on. Southern Mesopotamia is not an obvious place for civilization. It's not like Egypt, with a single Nile running in a predictable ribbon through the desert. Down here, between the Tigris and Euphrates, the land is a flat, low-lying fan of mud that those rivers have dumped for thousands of years. An alluvial plain spreading out toward the Gulf. On a map it looks simple. In reality, it's one of the most unstable landscapes humans have ever tried to live in. The rivers don't behave, they wander. Over centuries they shift their beds sideways across the plain, abandoning old channels, cutting new ones, fanning out into distributaries that merge and separate again. In flood season, they spill over their banks, spreading out into sheets of water that move slowly across the landscape, depositing fine silt, raising some areas, drowning others. This is both the problem and the promise. That silt is what makes the land so generous. Unlike older, exhausted soils, fresh alluvium is young. It's rich with minerals, constantly renewed, especially at the edges of floodwater. If you can get the water where you want it and keep it from staying too long, things grow. Grains, pulses, date palms along the levees, pastures in the low-lying areas as they dry out. In the right years, this plain can be astonishingly productive. But the same forces that bring fertility also bring danger. The floods can come too high or too late. A levee breaks, and an entire year's crop vanishes under brown water. The river decides it wants to bend a little more to the west, and suddenly your canal is a ditch leading to nowhere. A sequence of dry years, and irrigation water has to be pulled further and further from the main channel. Salts begin to accumulate in the soil as water evaporates and leaves its mineral load behind. Yields fall. Fields go white and hard. The land that was a gift becomes a trap. This is the tightrope that southern Mesopotamian communities walked. The landscape offered incredible potential, but only on condition of constant negotiation. You couldn't just plant and forget. You had to watch the water, learn its moods, and sooner or later start reshaping it. And then there were the marshes. In the lowest parts of the plain, where the rivers slowed and spread, broad wetlands formed. Not solid land, not open water, but something in between. Reed beds thick enough to walk on in places, open pools, narrow channels snaking through tall papyrus-like stands of vegetation. Seasonal fluctuations could turn dry ground into lagoon, and back again in the space of a few months. To people who didn't grow up there, this might have seemed like a wasteland. To the communities that learned it, it was a treasury. Reeds were everywhere, and they were everything. You could cut them for fuel. You could bind them into mats, lash them into walls, weave them into roofing. You could bundle them into boats. Whole houses could be made from bundled reed arches, light enough to go up quickly, flexible enough to survive when the ground beneath them shifted or flooded. The water itself was full of life. Fish in the channels, shellfish in the mud, waterfowl migrating in dense flocks, eggs taken from nests hidden in the reeds. The edges of the marsh supported grazing. Cattle, sheep, goats moved along with the seasons, feeding on tender growth after the water retreated. Wild pigs rooted in the damp soils. Turtles, amphibians, small game all added to the menu. And because the marsh is a maze, it's also a network. The channels between reed beds form natural boat routes. If you knew them, you could move quietly, quickly, carrying goods, people, stories between scattered settlements. If you didn't know them, you got lost. Modern marsh dwellers in southern Iraq still talk about this knowledge as a kind of inheritance. Which channel is navigable in low water? Which shortcut is safe in the dark, where the shoals form after flood season? It's not unreasonable to imagine that something similar existed 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. These early communities were not just living beside a wetland, they were inhabiting a three-dimensional landscape of water, mud, and vegetation that changed from month to month and year to year. In that kind of world, water management isn't a specialty, it's destiny. If you can smooth out the chaos of the floods just a little, if you can guide water into some areas and keep it out of others, the benefits compound. You get more predictable harvests. You can plant in places that would otherwise be too dry. You can keep animals watered through bad seasons. You can even create artificial marshes or maintain natural ones longer into the dry season, extending fishing and reed cutting. But every intervention increases your dependency. A simple diversion ditch becomes a small canal system. A small canal network needs upkeep. Digging, clearing, patching. Someone has to maintain the levees. Someone has to coordinate water sharing between fields. A community that invests in irrigation gains stability and surplus, but also becomes vulnerable to anything that disrupts that system. Drought, river shifts, conflict, neglect. And there's a hidden cost: salinization. Irrigation brings not just water but dissolved salts into the fields. If the drainage isn't sufficient, if water sits or evaporates on the surface instead of moving through the soil, those salts stay behind and accumulate. Over years and generations, land that once produced abundantly can decline, forcing people to move fields, adjust crops, or alter water management again. The same engineering that enables dense settlement demands continuous correction. This is the environmental background for everything that happens in the Ubard and afterward. Cities are not just piles of bricks. They are bet the community gambles on the ability to master this kind of landscape over long periods. But there's a second consequence, and it affects us as observers. A landscape built on soft alluvium, reshaped constantly by shifting rivers and human canals, is not kind to archaeology. Stone survives. Mud and reed do not. When a river abandons its channel, it doesn't politely step aside. It cuts into its banks, eats away at old levees, undercuts settlements perched too close, carries bricks and potsherds downstream. When it takes a new course, it can bury old sites under meters of fresh silt, sealing them away. Other times the river swings back centuries later and removes those buried layers entirely. Even where the rivers stay put, the weight of continuous building collapses older structures. In places like Eridu or Ur, what looks like a single mound is actually the compressed remains of dozens of building phases, stacked one on top of another. To reach the earliest levels, archaeologists have to dig down through the later city, sometimes through later temples built on precisely the same spot. Every trench is a compromise between what you uncover and what you have to destroy to get there. Add to that another complication. Deep time in a floodplain doesn't spread out horizontally, it stacks vertically. The earliest Ubaid layers in southern Mesopotamia are often tens of meters below the modern surface, hidden not only under later cities, but under more recent sediments deposited long after those cities were abandoned. In some areas, groundwater or modern agriculture makes deep excavation almost impossible. In others, the old channels and marsh zones have been reworked so thoroughly that earlier sites have been smeared into the landscape or removed altogether, so we're trying to reconstruct a story in which the main actors built in perishable materials on unstable ground, in a region where the stage itself keeps collapsing and being rebuilt. This is part of why the people who laid the foundations of urban life in Mesopotamia are so hard to see clearly. The land that made their cities possible is the same land that erases their traces, yet it doesn't erase everything. Foundations cut into older layers still leave scars in the soil. Clay bricks fired harder by accident or design can survive where raw mud brick melts away. Pits, post holes, canal lines, layers of occupation debris, the distinctive Ubaid pottery horizon, appearing in sediments far from its presumed origin. These fragments endure even when names, languages, and stories are gone. Which brings us back to the central mystery. In southern Mesopotamia, the landscape is not a neutral backdrop. It's an active force that shapes what can be built, how long it lasts, and what we can know about it later. It can wipe away whole towns and still preserve the faint outline of a platform beneath a later temple. It can erase the people who first learned to tame its water, while keeping the frameworks they invented embedded under the feet of those who came after. The Sumerians, when they finally appear in the written record, are living on top of someone else's solutions to this landscape. To see those earlier solutions, we have to follow the clues the floodplain grudgingly leaves us, and start looking for the communities that turn this generous, dangerous mud into something new, a network of settlements with a shared way of building and living. Those are the Ubaid communities, and to meet them, we have to look not just at the land, but at the style that stretches across it. When archaeologists talk about the Ubaid, they often start with something small enough to fit in your hand. A bowl. Not just any bowl, but one with a very particular look. Fine, relatively thin-walled clay, the surface carefully smoothed. The whole thing coated in a pale slip, then painted with dark geometric designs, cross-hatched panels, sweeping lines, simple but deliberate patterns. You see it at Eridu, at Tel El-Wei, at Ur, at sites stretching far to the north and east. Sit with that for a moment. Different villages, separated by days or weeks of walking or paddling, all shaping and decorating their clay in ways that rhyme with one another. That's what archaeologists call an Ubaid horizon. A horizon is not a single object or a single site. It's a band in time when, across a wide region, people start doing certain things in recognizably similar ways. It shows up in the pottery, in the way houses are laid out, in the small figurines people leave behind, even in how they bury their dead. In the Ubaid case, the pottery is the clearest signal. Earlier Neolithic communities in the region had their own local traditions. Heavier wares, different tempers in the clay, bold colours or none at all. Then, somewhere around the 6th millennium BCE, you start seeing this pale, painted style radiating out. But this doesn't mean an Ubaid emperor marched across Mesopotamia handing out standardized bowls. The mainstream view is much quieter and in some ways more interesting. A horizon like this usually means that ideas are moving, not armies. Potters see a style they like, perhaps in a neighbour's house at a seasonal gathering, in gifts exchanged along a marsh channel or caravan path, and they imitate it. Maybe they tweak the design, substitute a local clay, combine it with older traditions. Over a few generations the style spreads, shifts, but remains recognizable. It's the material trace of conversations we can't hear anymore. The same thing happens with houses. Walk across an Ubaid village in your mind. Most of what was there is gone now, eaten by time and water, but the foundations and floor plans leave a ghost map. You'd see a repeated pattern, multi-room houses, often built around a central hall or main room, with smaller side chambers tucked along the edges. Sometimes there's a clear front room, a kind of reception or work area, and more private spaces further in. The buildings are rectangular, made of mud brick, aligned in ways that suggest people were thinking carefully about space, light, and neighbours. This isn't random hut clustering, it's household architecture. A house in this world is not just a structure, it's a social unit, an extended family, several nuclear families bound together, elders, children, dependents, maybe a few unrelated people attached through work or obligation. The house stores grain, tools, ritual objects. It hosts meals, negotiations, small ceremonies. It has a history. Across Ubaid sites, the recurrence of these house forms suggests a shared way of imagining what a proper dwelling, and by extension, a proper household, should be. Yet the details vary. In some regions the walls are thicker, in others the rooms more elongated. Some villages show houses packed tightly, others spaced out with yards or work areas between them. It's a common language with local accents. Among the small finds inside and around these houses are the Ubaid figurines. They're often small, made of clay, with elongated bodies and stylized, sometimes almost lizard-like heads. Some hold infants, others stand alone. Their exact meaning is debated. Were they household deities, protective spirits, ancestors, toys? Mainstream archaeology doesn't have a single answer, but their distribution and their broadly similar style hints at shared beliefs or shared ways of making sense of the invisible world, even as each community used them in its own context. So what did daily life look like for the people who used these bowls, built these houses, handled these figurines? Picture a village of a few dozen households strung along a levee or perched on slightly raised ground near a marsh edge. Most people are farmers and herders, but farming here is not a 9-to-5 job, it's a seasonal rhythm. Intense bursts of labour at sowing, irrigating, harvest, interspersed with periods when there is time for other things. Kin networks organise much of this life. Extended families work fields together, share tools, arrange marriages, negotiate water access. Local leaders likely emerge, not kings, not yet, but elders, successful household heads, perhaps ritual specialists. Authority is personal and situational. The person who knows how to read the river, the one who can call in relatives from another settlement when labour is short. The woman who keeps track of seeds and stories. Inequality at this stage is subtle. Some houses are larger, some have nicer goods, some graves contain more or better pottery. This hints at gradual social differentiation, influence accumulating in certain lineages, access to more surplus, control over key resources or ritual roles. But there are no palaces, no royal tombs. Power is still embedded in households and kin groups more than in institutions. Amid this, something transformative is happening almost unnoticed: craft specialization. Those painted bowls are not all the work of casual once-a-year potters. When archaeologists look closely, they see patterns that suggest trained hands, consistent wall thickness, repeated motifs rendered with confidence, standardized shapes that fit together in sets. This doesn't necessarily mean full-time professionals in the modern sense. It can start with part-time specialists, someone in the village who is simply better at making pots and does more of it, a family known for their figurines, a line of people who have learned to work particular kinds of stone or shell. But the implications are large. As certain people spend more time perfecting these skills, others must be producing enough food to support them. Time is being freed from immediate subsistence and invested in reliability, quality, and perhaps beauty. Objects begin to carry signatures of individual or family styles, even as they conform to the broader Ubaid look. Over distance, this quiet specialization makes the horizon sharper. A pot from one village can travel to another as a trade item, a bride wealth gift, an offering. The recipient recognizes it. The form, the paint, the way the clay was fired. They know, without words, that somewhere out there are people who live in houses not so different from theirs, grow crops not so different, and think that this is what a proper pot should look like. Bit by bit, the villages stop feeling like isolated dots in the landscape and start becoming nodes in something wider. Channels through the marsh, footpaths along levees, seasonal routes across higher ground. All of these carry more than goods. They carry shared practices, gossip, knowledge about planting times and river moods, stories of distant shrines or respected lineages, maybe even early reputations of places like Eridu. By the late Ubaid, when you stand in one of these riverine villages, you're no longer standing at the edge of the world. You're standing inside a network. Your pots, your house plan, your small clay figurines all say so. And when enough of those nodes begin to cluster, when one settlement starts to draw in more people, more specialists, more ritual attention than the others, something new comes into focus. A village begins to look and to feel like the first city. If you follow those networks down into the deep south of Mesopotamia, to where the rivers fray into marsh and lagoon, one name keeps coming up: Eridu. In later Sumerian lists, Eridu is always there, always early, and almost always first. When scribes write out the kings before the flood, they start with Eridu. When myths talk about how civilization began, They say that kingship, the right to rule, came down from heaven and first settled in Eridu. That's already a clue. By the time Sumerian authors were carving their histories onto clay, Eridu was not just a place on a map. It was a symbol, a way of saying there was a starting point. But long before those scribes, there were mud bricks. Eridu is one of those rare sites where the archaeology and the myth actually nod to each other. When excavators cut down into the mound, they didn't hit a single temple or a single village. They hit layer after layer after layer of occupation, stacked one on top of the next like a compressed history of southern Mesopotamia. At the core of that stack is a modest rise, an artificial hill built entirely out of earlier buildings. The deeper you go, the simpler the structures become, until you're down in the 6th millennium BCE, the Ubaid period, among small, carefully made mud brick rooms, thick walls, and beaten earth floors. Then you climb back up through time, and you notice a pattern. The same spot keeps being rebuilt. An early rectangular building with a central room is replaced by a slightly larger version, which is replaced again by something more elaborate. Walls get thicker. Platforms appear, raising certain rooms above the others. Benches, niches, and altars start to show up. The ground plan shifts from a building to something that looks very much like an early temple. This is what archaeologists mean when they talk about repeated rebuilding on a sacred spot. People are not scattering new shrines randomly through the settlement. They are coming back generation after generation to the same location, tearing down the old structure when it wears out or is ritually finished, and putting a new one in its place. Over centuries, this creates a physical memory. The mound grows higher, not because anyone set out to make a hill, but because they would not leave this place alone. Around this ritual core, the settlement thickens. In the earliest Ubaid levels, Eridu looks like a cluster of houses and storage rooms around a central building. By the later Ubaid, the built-up area expands, with neighbourhoods of houses aligned in ways that echo the planned rectangular style seen across the horizon. Paths form between them, open spaces, courtyards, workyards, perhaps small plazas, appear and reappear. This is not just a haphazard sprawl. The way buildings are laid out suggests planning and replanning. Someone or some group is deciding where front doors should face, how closely houses can crowd the central precinct, where boundaries between sacred and ordinary space should fall. And within that central precinct, something else is happening. The buildings are not only larger, they're different in kind. Rooms are arranged around a main hall that seems to have been the focus of gatherings. Side chambers may have stored offerings, tools, or valuables. The architecture funnels movement. You enter here, proceed there, come into the presence of something or someone. This is what archaeologists call public architecture. Not because the building had a sign over the door, but because it is sized and shaped for activities that involve more than a single household. Rituals, meetings, feasts, redistributions of grain, or fish, or dates. Things that concern many people at once. When you see this kind of architecture linked to a long, uninterrupted sequence of rebuilding in a settlement that grows larger and more complex over centuries, it's reasonable to think you're looking at more than just a village. One cautious way to put it is this. During the Ubaid, Eridu may have functioned as a regional sacred and administrative centre. Sacred because of that stubborn insistence on the same holy spot, the investment in platforms and halls and altars, the later memory that this was the dwelling of the god Enki, lord of fresh water and wisdom. Administrative. Not in the sense of modern bureaucracy, but in the older sense of coordinating things, collecting offerings from surrounding communities, storing surplus, organising labour for building and irrigation, hosting rituals that required people, goods, and information to flow in from a wider hinterland. Surveys around Eridu suggest that other smaller sites dotted the nearby landscape. It's easy to imagine households from those hamlets making periodic trips to Eridu's temple mound, bringing offerings, asking favours from the god, perhaps settling disputes under the eyes of the priests and elders who lived or worked there. If that picture is roughly right, then Eridu starts to look like something more than just another node. It's a node that pulls. It draws in people, resources, craft production, and ritual attention. It anchors stories. It shapes calendars and obligations. Over time, it accumulates prestige. This is probably why, thousands of years later, Sumerian scribes couldn't resist putting Eridu at the head of their lists. Whether or not Eridu was literally the first big settlement in the south, it had become the idea of a first city, the place where you say everything began when you want your story of origins to feel weighty and old. But how far do we want to go with that word? City? Here the ground gets slippery. Archaeologists and historians argue about what exactly counts as a city. Is it a matter of population size? Of having full-time specialists and formal institutions? Of dense housing and clear neighbourhood structure? Of written administration? By some definitions, nothing in the Ubaid period quite qualifies. The true city-states of Mesopotamia, with big defensive walls, palaces, records of taxes and rations, emerge later in the Uruk and early dynastic periods. By other softer definitions, Eridu in the late Ubaid looks very close. It's larger than its neighbours. It has a distinct sacred administrative core. It likely hosted more than one kind of specialist, ritual experts, builders, potters, maybe boat makers and net weavers serving a broad community. It sat at the centre of routes through marsh and river. The truth is, the line between large village and early city is fuzzy, and where we choose to draw it changes the story we tell. If you insist that a city must have writing, then Eridu can never be first. If you allow that cities begin as places where people concentrate around institutions bigger than any household, temples, councils, managed stores of surplus, then Eridu becomes a very strong candidate for an early city in everything but name. Mainstream archaeology tends to tread carefully here. The safest statement is that Eridu is one of the earliest and longest-lived urban-like centres in southern Mesopotamia, a place where sacred power and practical coordination overlapped, and where that overlap was built into the bricks. Whatever label we prefer, the pattern is clear. In Eridu, we see Ubaid house styles, pottery and figurines coalescing around a focal point that is no longer just a household shrine. We see a settlement that outlives fashions, climate shifts and political experiments, precisely because people keep returning to the same elevated patch of ground. And in the stories later, people tell about Eridu, about kingship descending there first, about gods dwelling in its temple. We catch a glimpse of how those long millennia of rebuilding and gathering were remembered, as the beginning of something new in the human experience. An origin not just of a town, but of the very idea that there could be a first city at all. But Eridu is only half of the story. If you move a little to the northeast, to another low mound half lost in fields and irrigation ditches, you find a place that pushes the story of settlement in the deep south even further back in time. Tel el-Weli, it's not a famous name, it doesn't star in any king lists. There are no myths about gods descending there, no later pilgrims writing hymns to its sanctuaries. For most of its life, it was probably just one more cluster of houses on the flat horizon, and that's exactly why it matters. When archaeologists cut into Tel el-Weli, they found something that made a lot of people sit up and rethink their timelines. Under later Ubaid levels, under the familiar greenish-painted pottery and rectangular houses, there were still more layers, earlier layers, Ubaid, but older than the Ubaid they thought they knew. Instead of a neat beginning, the southern alluvium suddenly had a depth. This is what archaeologists call a deep sequence of occupation. Stratum after stratum of human living stacked on top of each other, with very little empty time in between. No long gap where the site is abandoned and sand blows over it. Just continuous rebuilding, repair, and reuse. In the case of Tel el-Weli, that sequence runs back into the very earliest phases of the Ubaid, the 6th millennium BCE, maybe even nudging into the period when Ubaid styles were only just crystallizing. Why does that matter? Because if you want to understand how a landscape that floods unpredictably, shifts channels, and turns to mud every rainy season ends up supporting towns and eventually cities, continuity is the key. A single well-organized village could be a lucky accident. A long chain of rebuilding on the same patch of ground, generation after generation, is something else. It says, people learned how to live here, and they passed that knowledge on. Tel el-Weli shows us that learning in slow motion. In the lowest levels, you already see people committing to place. They're shaping mud bricks, laying out rooms with straight walls and right angles, defining thresholds and corners. These are not windbreak shelters thrown up for a season and forgotten. They are houses with life cycles, built, repaired, subdivided, sometimes demolished and rebuilt a few meters away. The domestic architecture is modest. Single-story buildings with a few rooms, sometimes grouped around a small courtyard. Hearths set in the floor, storage jars sunk into the ground, working areas where grain could be processed, fish cleaned, tools made. All the quiet, repetitive work that never makes it into epics, but without which no temple, no city can exist. Here, far from the later prestige of Eridu's temple mound, you see the foundation of that later world. Households. People deciding where to sleep, where to cook, where to store grain away from damp and mice. People figuring out which wall needs to be thicker to keep out winter winds, which door should face which direction to catch the light in a certain season. People experimenting with how close you can build to your neighbour without their smoke choking your courtyard. This is where urbanism really begins if you strip the word down to its bones, not with ziggurats and processions, but with small-scale decisions about how to share space over time. Tel el-Weli also gives us a window onto early food strategies tuned to this particular landscape. The southern alluvium is not a simple environment. It's a constantly shifting mosaic of levees, back swamps, seasonal pools, and slightly raised patches that stay just dry enough. Early Ubaid farmers here were not just copying techniques from the north, they were adapting. The plant remains and animal bones from Tel el-Weli suggest a mixed economy. Cereals like barley grown on slightly higher, better drained ground. Small plots that could be watered with simple channels or by catching the natural spread of floodwater. Herds of sheep and goats move between drier patches and the edges of wetlands, feeding on reeds and rough vegetation. At the same time, there are hints of wetland exploitation, fish bones, shells, the kinds of tools you associate with cutting reeds or working soft marsh-grown wood. This wasn't a pure farmer village in the modern sense. It was a community learning to knit together farming, herding, and wetland foraging into a single resilient way of life. Over centuries, those strategies get refined. You can trace small shifts in the proportions of crops and animals from level to level, subtle changes in house layout that might reflect different ways of storing harvests or penning animals. Maybe a move from keeping animals right inside the courtyard to tethering them just outside the house cluster. Maybe experiments with larger storage rooms shared by more than one household. None of these things scream revolution, but that's the point. The deep sequence shows how stability is built not from dramatic one-time breakthroughs, but from countless small decisions that work well enough to be repeated, and repeated again. The broader implication is easy to miss because it feels so ordinary. When we talk about city life, we tend to picture walls and markets and rulers. At Tel el-Weli, you see the prehistory of all that, stripped of its monuments. A family deciding to rebuild on the same spot because the soil is known and the neighbours are known. Another family adding a room rather than moving away, because the canal is already dug and the fields are already measured out in their minds. A community learning where floodwater tends to pool, which years to plant early and which to wait. Those choices add up. Stay in one place long enough, and you start to invest in it differently. You line up your new walls with the traces of the old ones. You expect that paths will still be there next year. You begin to think in terms of our village, our fields, our water, even if nobody has formal titles yet. Tel el-Weli captures that mental shift in its layers. No grand temple dominates the mound in these early levels. No king's palace throws its weight around. What you see instead is the quiet, stubborn insistence on continuity in a land that does not naturally encourage it. A determination to make this patch of shifting mud into a place that children will recognize and grandchildren after them. By the time we arrive at later obeyed centers like Eridu, with its raised platforms and public halls, a lot of the groundwork, literally and figuratively, has already been laid at places like Tel el-Weli. The habit of rebuilding instead of wandering, the practical knowledge of how to coax crops out of floodplain edges and graze herds along reed beds without destroying them, the social rhythms of neighbours who have lived side by side for long enough to develop unspoken rules about noise, smoke, paths and shared wells. If the myths later remembered Eridu as the first city, the archaeology of Tel el-Weli whispers a quieter truth beneath that story. That city life begins much earlier, not as a sudden invention, but as a long accumulation of ordinary choices. Sleep, work, plant, harvest, repair, rebuild. Do that for a few centuries in the same place, and you don't just have a village. You have the deep roots of settlement that make cities possible. Stay in one place long enough, and sooner or later you start wanting a place that belongs to everyone. Not just the lane between houses or the hard-packed space where kids play and animals are tethered. A place that feels like it stands slightly apart from daily mess. A place you can point to and say, that's where we go when it really matters. In the southern alluvium, the first clear archaeological traces of that kind of place show up as something deceptively simple. Slightly raised platforms with buildings on top. At Eridu, those platforms become famous, but they don't start out as the towering stepped ziggurats you might be picturing. In the earliest levels, what archaeologists uncover is modest. A low mud brick podium, maybe a metre or so above the surrounding ground, with a small, carefully laid out building sitting on it. Seen from eye level in its own time, it wouldn't have looked gigantic, but it would have felt different. For one thing, it was high. In a landscape where everything is flat and floods creep in from every side, even a small rise changes your relationship to the world. A platform keeps your walls a little drier. It makes the building stand out on the horizon. It forces you to walk up, to climb, even if it's only a few steps. That climb matters. To build one of these early temple platforms, you can't just have a single family quietly remodeling their house. You need hands. People to shape bricks, carry them, lay them. People to cut and haul reed mats for foundations, to smooth plaster, to repair cracks after the first rains. In other words, you need organised labour. We don't see project managers' notes or timesheets, but the architecture itself tells you coordination is happening. The walls are straight and aligned. The corners are right angles. The building is oriented with care, often following a consistent axis through multiple rebuilds. That consistency is a clue. It suggests that when the platform and its building were constructed, they were already understood as more than just another house. They were a shared project, something that required agreement. Archaeologists tend to call these buildings temples because of what's found in and around them. Altars or offering tables, niches in walls, deposits of special objects, concentrations of animal bones that look like remnants of feasting or ritual meals. Sometimes small clay figurines, sometimes distinctive vessels that aren't the everyday cooking pots found in houses. But temple can be a bit misleading if it makes you imagine a separate religious class sweeping in and taking over. In the Ubaid period, we're probably looking at something more woven into ordinary life. Ritual center? Yes, almost certainly. People gathered here to make offerings, to mark seasonal transitions, to ask for good floods and safe pregnancies, to remember the dead. The layout of rooms and focal points inside the building suggests controlled movement and attention, places where someone stood or sat while others watched. Meeting place? Very likely. A raised hall at the heart of the settlement is a good spot for elders to resolve disputes, for heads of households to discuss canal maintenance, for agreements to be made when to plant or when to move herds. Storage hub? The evidence leans that way. In several early temple compounds, archaeologists find concentrations of large storage jars, bins, and thick-floored rooms that could handle heavy loads. Grain, dried fish, reed mats, tools, things that belong to the community or are being held in trust, rather than sitting in a single family's courtyard. Symbol of shared identity, almost inevitably. When you participate in building, repairing, and refurbishing the same structure over generations, it becomes a physical anchor for ideas about us, our mound, our platform, our god, or gods, or spirits, or simply the powers that make crops grow and rivers flow. What we don't have is their words for any of this. That's the line we have to hold carefully between evidence and interpretation. On the ground, what's actually there are mud brick walls, plastered floors, post holes, ash layers, discarded bones, fragments of special vessels, traces of coloured paint in some cases, repeated rebuilds on almost exactly the same footprint. Layer after layer, the same spot is cleared, filled, levelled, and built over again. Sometimes the new building copies the plan of the old one almost exactly. Sometimes it's a little larger, or more complex with extra rooms tacked on, thicker walls, a higher platform. From that we infer continuity of function and meaning. It's not that we know the precise rituals carried out there, or which deities were addressed, or what stories were told about them. Those belong to a meaning system that mostly died with the people who lived it. Our words, shrine, temple, cult, are rough approximations. What we can see clearly, though, is the pattern of sacred permanence being created. When the same spot is rebuilt again and again for centuries, it stops being just a convenient dry place. It becomes a point of memory. A child growing up in late Ubaid Eridu would never have known a time when that mound, that raised building, didn't exist in some form. Their parents would have similar memories. Their grandparents might tell stories of when the platform was lower, or before the new walls were added, but the place itself is continuous. In a world where rivers change course and houses crumble and get moved, this is unusual. The temple platform insists on staying put. It locks a piece of the landscape into a longer time frame than any single lifespan. That's powerful. It means that when decisions need to be made that affect more than one household, there is an obvious, almost unquestioned place to gather. If offerings of grain and fish and animals are regularly piling up there, someone has to manage them. If there are jars of seed for years when the flood fails, someone decides when they can be opened and who receives what. This is where the sacred begins to shade into administration. We don't yet see clay tablets or written tallies, but we do see the architectural signs of growing coordination. Attached rooms that look like ancillary storage, carefully organized courtyards, standardized doorways that control access in and out of inner spaces. Imagine a festival at harvest. Families bring portions of their grain, oil, or animals to the platform, leaving some behind as offerings. Part is consumed in communal feasting. Everyone eats, everyone participates. Part is set aside, stored in those big jars in the temple compound. On the surface, it's devotion and celebration. Underneath, it's accounting. Who keeps track of what's come in? Who decides when stores are distributed in a bad year? Who organizes repairs when the platform slumps or the walls crack? The people who hold those roles, whether you think of them as elders, priests, stewards, or just the individuals everyone trusts to hold the keys, are quietly becoming something new, managers of surplus on behalf of the community. From the outside, the temple platform still looks like a place of ritual first. The offerings and altars are what jump out to us archaeologically. But intertwined with that sacred function, we can see the early threads of coordinated labor and centralized storage, the kind of logistical thinking that later, in the Uruk and Sumerian periods, will explode into full-blown temple economies with scribes and ration distributions. For now, it's all still embedded in mud brick, in paths worn by bare feet, in habits of climbing a few steps to reach a building that is everyone's and no one's at the same time. The first temple platforms don't announce the arrival of bureaucracy. They whisper it. A slightly higher floor, a slightly thicker wall, a place where gifts to the gods and resources for the village mingle in the same jars. From that raised sacred space, the next step is almost inevitable. If the temple can hold and bless the surplus, it can also help plan for it, which is where water and the people who control it begin to matter more than ever. If you live on a dry edge of a great river plain, planning for surplus mostly means planning for water. The southern alluvium is a strange kind of gift. Rainfall is low, summers are brutal, and yet just a little way off, a river is trying to give you more water than you can possibly handle. Just not when or where you need it. That mismatch is where irrigation begins. Forget for a moment the great arterial canals you might associate with later Mesopotamian kingdoms. Wind back to something humbler. A small settlement near a natural levee, a slight rise where the river once flowed and left its mud behind. Just beyond the houses, a low earth bank thrown up with baskets and bare hands nudges part of the seasonal flood out into a shallow channel. That channel runs along the contour of the land, losing height slowly, encouraged by a few spade cuts and reed bundles jammed into its sides. From it, smaller cuts lead off toward fields, which are not yet endless rectangles, but modest plots hugged close to the village. This is irrigation in its simplest form, coaxing water from where it wants to go to where you need it instead. Over time, those simple channels turn into systems. Archaeologists working in the region see traces of these early efforts in buried canal beds, in the orientation of field boundaries, in patterns of settlement that hug old watercourses. The details are still debated, exact layouts, how continuous the networks really were, but the broad picture is solid. By the Ubaid period, people in southern Mesopotamia weren't just hoping the flood would be kind, they were intervening. Raise a levee here to hold the river back, cut a gap there to divert it into a feeder channel, scrape out the bottom of that channel each year because silt settles fast, reinforce a weak point with a woven curtain of reeds and mud, walk the line after a storm to see what held and what failed. None of this requires kings or armies of conscripted workers. It does require agreement. Whose field gets watered first when the canal level is just high enough to flow? Who is responsible for clearing the weeds and mud that choke the narrower branches? What happens if someone desperate in a dry year cuts an unauthorized breach to send more water to their own plot, starving the fields downstream? These are not abstract questions. They are the stuff of everyday survival. The temple platform we just left behind is a perfect place to talk about the flood, to ask for good water at the right time. It is also a perfect place to argue about the canal's schedule, to announce at the end of a feast, next 8 days this side of the village clears the main channel, or after the next rise, households along the eastern ditch get first watering. Irrigation, even at this early scale, forces cooperation into a calendar. Water arrives in pulses. The river rises, then falls. Pumping by hand is possible but exhausting. Far better to time your planting and your gate openings to the natural flow. That means someone, maybe a handful of experienced elders, maybe younger specialists who know the land, has to watch the river and translate its moods into dates and tasks. We start to see the fingerprints of that translation in the archaeology indirectly. Settlements strung along old canal lines. Fields laid out in repeated orientations, suggesting coordinated planning rather than each family improvising alone. Layers of recut canal beds, showing maintenance over generations, and woven through it all the quiet emergence of rules. Anthropologists looking at later well-documented irrigation societies, from Bali to Spain, see the same themes play out. Water turns neighbors into partners and sometimes into rivals. It rewards those who can build and maintain trust. It punishes those who don't show up on cleaning day or who sabotage their neighbors' gates in the night. There's no reason to think the Ubaid South was any different in that regard. Yet irrigation isn't just a social glue, it's also a slow-acting risk. Bring river water onto your fields year after year, and you're not just moving H2O, you're moving dissolved minerals. Under a hot sun, with poor drainage, the water evaporates and leaves the salts behind, whitening the soil, poisoning plants. This is salinization, and in southern Mesopotamia it becomes a serious problem much later in the historical record. In the Ubaid period, we're catching the process early. The fields are smaller. The floods are still cutting fresh channels in some places, flushing salts away. People can abandon a patch of land that's gone sour and move slightly upslope, or closer to a new stream. But even then, the basic tension is there. The more you fix the river in place, the more you risk locking in long-term problems. Canals silt up, levees fail. A successful layout invites more houses, more fields, more mouths depending on a pattern of water that might only hold for a few generations before the river shifts again. The very engineering that creates a surplus also creates new vulnerabilities. History doesn't record the meetings where this was first felt as unease rather than disaster. The moment when someone looked at a sluggish canal choked with mud and realized, if we don't clear this before the next rise, half our crops will die. But crises that later texts describe, failed floods, boundary disputes, accusations of water theft, have their roots in this earlier period, in these first experiments with tying human time to river time. Against that backdrop, the idea of surplus takes on a different flavour. With water under some degree of control, harvest can be more predictable. Instead of each household scraping by on what its own labour can coax from dry ground, coordinated irrigation can lift yields across the community. A well-timed flood into a well-levelled field gives you more grain than you strictly need to survive the year. What do you do with that extra? Some of it, as we've seen, goes into storage around the temple platform, seed grain, emergency reserves, offerings that double as insurance. But once a baseline of food security is reached for many households, something else becomes possible. A few people can spend less time in the fields. They might still own or claim land, but their daily work shifts. Someone becomes very good at organizing canal crews, remembering who worked when, who's owed a share of water. Someone becomes skilled at making the same shape of pot over and over, perfect for storing grain in a temple room. Someone else starts to spend more days on the platform itself, tending the hearth, managing the flow of offerings in and out. This is the slow engineering of specialization, driven not by ideology, but by calories. Irrigation doesn't instantly create full-time priests or bureaucrats. It creates a cushion. And in that cushion, tiny differences in role can grow. A season where a canal overseer's decisions save a harvest might make everyone more willing to let him focus on that task next year. A craftsperson whose jars keep rats out of the stored grain might find their work suddenly in higher demand. We're still far from the regimented ration systems of later temple economies. There are no written lists assigning beer and bread to named workers. What we have instead are the early preconditions: water systems that require planning, surplus that accumulates in shared spaces, and the emerging class of people whose value to the community lies less in how many hours they spend sowing seeds and more in how well they can coordinate, craft, and decide. From the outside, life in a Nubad village probably still looked mostly like farming and herding. But underneath, in the lines of the canals and the arguments over who cleans which section when, you can feel the future city taking shape. A city is not just walls and streets, it's a web of obligations tied to things that must be maintained together. In southern Mesopotamia, that web begins with water running through mud-cut channels, and the quiet realization that if you can organize a flood, you can organize a lot of other things too. For all this talk of canals and levees, there's a crucial detail about southern Mesopotamia that's easy to miss if you imagine it as endlessly flat farmland. Large parts of it weren't fields at all. They were marsh. Not the small, scraggly wetlands that ring a modern reservoir, but vast mosaics of open water. Reed beds, floating vegetation, mud flats and low islands. A landscape that wasn't quite land and wasn't quite river. A place where the ground could change between seasons, sometimes between years. People didn't avoid that world. They moved into it. Imagine a Nubide community not on a single solid patch of earth, but stretched across a cluster of slightly raised islands and levees. One bit of high ground holds a core of houses and communal buildings. Another, a short paddle away, is used for gardens during the dry months. A third is mainly for animals, fenced with reed hurdles that are cheap to build and easy to move if the waterline creeps up. It's not a single compact village so much as a little archipelago of occupation. In a place like this, settlement pattern becomes a flexible thing. Some households may stay on the central mound year-round, tending storage pits and looking after whatever passes for the temple. Others split their time. During the spring floods, they camp on temporary platforms along the edge of the deeper channels, close to fish runs and bird colonies. As the waters recede, they shift out to plant on freshly exposed silt or to harvest wild stands of grain that grow on the margins. Mobility isn't a failure to settle, it's part of the strategy. And because the marsh offers so many different kinds of food and raw materials, a family doesn't have to commit fully to one way of making a living. The economies here are mixed almost by default. You can herd cattle or sheep on slightly higher, drier ground. But when the river rises, you move them to a levee and spend a month focused on fishing instead. You can plant small plots of barley where a cut channel drains slowly, but you're not ruined if the crop fails, because you can still gather edible reeds, snare waterfowl and trade fish for grain grown on better drained fields upstream. It's a buffer against bad years that doesn't rely solely on stored surplus. It relies on diversity. Wetlands are famously productive ecosystems, and the Ubaid marsh dwellers seem to have leaned into that. Fish, shellfish, turtles, birds' eggs, wild pigs, reeds for thatch and matting, timber from riverine groves, clay from channel banks. Layer all that on top of garden plots and small fields, and you can support more people per square kilometre than a purely dry farming landscape at the same technological level. That matters because it means you can get relatively dense populations and even proto-urban clusters before full-scale intensive agriculture is spread everywhere. In some areas, the first towns may have been more like marsh hubs than dryland cities, nodal points in a watery network where goods and people converged, even while a lot of food was still coming from wild or semi-wild resources. In that world, the most important piece of infrastructure isn't necessarily a road, it's a boat. The rivers and channels of the southern alluvium are not just barriers to be bridged, they are the easiest routes between communities. You can push a heavy load of reeds, timber or clay on a shallow draft boat with less effort than dragging it across soggy ground. You can move a basket of grain from one island to another without ever lifting it onto your back. Ubaid pottery and carved seals show simple boats, likely made from bundled reeds or light wooden frames covered in reed matting and bitumen. Nothing grand by later standards, but perfectly suited to narrow channels and shallow lagoons. Those boats turn the entire marsh into a kind of extended village. Need more thatching bundles for your roof? Paddle to the big reed stand 2 bends away and cut them, then float them back on a raft. Want to visit kin in a settlement on a neighbouring levee? Leave at dawn and be back by nightfall without ever touching a dry path. Have surplus grain stored around the temple mound? Load it into boats after the harvest and distribute it to satellite hamlets, or bring in fish and reeds as reciprocal offerings. From an archaeological perspective, this creates linkages that are hard to see in the dirt but would have been obvious on the water. A set of sites that look small and scattered on a modern map may actually be the tightly integrated neighbourhoods of a single boat-centred community. Ceramic styles and building techniques that seem widespread along a river might reflect frequent visits by people who can paddle up or downstream much more easily than they could walk. You can think of the waterways themselves as the first real transport network of southern Mesopotamia, long before formal roads and royal canals. They carry not just goods, but stories, marriage partners, news of flood levels, rumours of better grazing. And yet this same watery landscape is exactly what makes the deep past here so hard to reconstruct. Mud brick dissolves, reed walls rot. A mound that was dry and occupied in one century might be eroding into a channel the next. Fresh silt covers everything. A site that once sat proudly above the water could, in a later phase, be buried under several meters of alluvium, with younger communities built on top or slightly aside. Waterlogging can be a blessing, preserving plant remains and wooden artifacts in oxygen-poor layers. But it also means that many early marsh settlements are invisible from the surface, or accessible only with deep coring and lucky trench placement. Channels migrate over time. A stream that once ran just east of a village swings west centuries later, slicing off part of the occupation and washing it away. Erosion bites at the edges of mounds. Rising groundwater and modern drainage projects complicate excavation further. So when we try to map Ubaid marshland life, we're almost certainly seeing only the upper edges of a much denser web. Archaeologists can identify certain mounds with Ubaid levels, trace old levees, pick up scattered sherds along ancient channel banks. They can compare this to modern and recent marsh cultures, such as the Madan or marsh Arabs, whose lifeways, house platforms of reeds, water buffalo herding, boat-based travel, show how a human society can be thoroughly, confidently adapted to wetlands. But they also have to admit there are big gaps. Whole landscapes may lie under modern rivers or beneath thick packages of silt that we're only beginning to probe. What we can say is that living in a marsh shapes more than just your subsistence. It shapes identity. If your earliest memories are of climbing into a boat before you can walk confidently, if your sense of direction is keyed to channels and reed beds rather than hills and roads, you think with water in mind. Terms for currents, types of mud, stages of flooding, all matter. Skills like reading ripples, recognizing bird calls, knowing which patch of reeds hides a firm landing and which is treacherous, become part of what it means to be competent, to be an adult. Those patterns can survive changes that show up clearly in our records. New pottery styles, new architectural details, new elites claiming to rule from a temple mound. Languages can shift, gods can be renamed, a new city upstream can demand taxes and canal work. But underneath, the daily choreography of boats at dawn, animals led to the levee edge, children sent to cut reeds, elders scanning the water level against old marks on a post, that can continue for centuries, even millennia. By the time Sumerian scribes start writing about cities like Ur and Eridu, about kings and temples and wars, many of their people are still in practice marsh folk. They build in mud brick and reed. They travel by boat as much as by foot. They manage lives that rise and fall with the river. Behind the first written names of cities, there is this older, quieter tradition of waterborne living, a civilization of islands and channels, of mixed economies and seasonal moves that helped make dense settlement possible long before anyone thought to press a reed stylus into wet clay. To follow the story of cities before Sumer, we have to keep that marsh in mind. Half hidden under later deposits, hard to excavate, but absolutely central to how these early communities grew, traded, and thought of themselves. The marsh may feel like the center of our story, but to people living there in the Ubaid period, it was only one node in a much bigger world. If you drifted your boat out along a main channel, followed it down to where the water widened into the Gulf, then turned your mental map outward, you'd find that your home was just the southern edge of a long, fertile arc. To the north, beyond the palm stands and the last marshes, the rivers broke into broader valleys and rolling plains. This was northern Mesopotamia. Rain-fed fields instead of irrigation, villages perched on low hills rather than islands, houses built on firm ground that didn't flood every year. Places like Tel Arpachia and Tepegara, later names for ancient tells, show communities with their own versions of painted pottery, their own local styles, but recognizably part of the same broad cultural zone. To the east, across the river and over the low foothills lay Susiana, the plain around what would later be called Susa, and beyond that the highlands of Elam and the Zagros. Here the land climbed quickly, pasture opened between ridges, streams cut down from mountains that held what the lowlands lacked: hard stone, metals, timber. The people there were not marsh folk, but they were not strangers either. Their sites show Ubaid-like ceramics in some phases, and local versions in others. This was a frontier in the literal sense, where floodplain and highland met, but it was not a hard border. To the south and southeast the Gulf itself mattered. In the Ubaid period, its shoreline was not in the same place it is today. Sea level, sediment, and river courses have all shifted, but there were certainly coastal communities strung along its edges and on emerging spits and islands. They had access to abundant fish and shellfish, and to marine shells that could be turned into beads and inlays highly valued inland. And to the west lay the steppe margins, drier, more open lands where rainfall was less reliable, and people might split their time between farming and herding, or move seasonally with flocks. These were not empty spaces. They were the corridors through which animals and people and ideas crossed between river valleys. Southern Mesopotamia was not an isolated experiment in marsh living. It sat at the downstream end of a whole system. Water and silt flowed toward it. So did people and goods and styles. Archaeologists trace this system most clearly through objects that do not belong to the alluvium at all. The southern plain is poor in good stone. It has plenty of clay, mud, and reeds, but almost no high-quality nappable rock. Yet Ubaid sites in the south contain blades and tools made from obsidian, volcanic glass that fractures into razor-sharp edges. That obsidian can be chemically traced back to sources in Anatolia and the mountains of northern Mesopotamia. The same goes for certain kinds of hard stone used for axes, grinding stones, and seal carving. The south lacks those quarries. The material had to come from upland regions. Copper, too, is absent from the alluvium, yet small copper artifacts appear in late Ubaid contexts. The ore came from Iran or Anatolia, smelted somewhere upstream or up mountain, then passed hand to hand until it reached the marsh towns, where it could be hammered into pins, awls, or ornaments. From the other direction came shells from the Gulf and beyond. specific species of marine shell appear inland, carved into pendants or set into decorative inlays. Bitumen, naturally occurring asphalt, shows up as lumps, coatings, and caulking, used to waterproof boats, baskets, and perhaps even building elements. Some local sources likely existed, but others seem to have been exploited along the Middle Euphrates and in the Gulf region. Timber is another key piece. The southern plain has palms and some riverine trees, but for long straight beams and durable planks, you want wood from upland forests. Evidence of imported timbers shows up indirectly, in roof spans and construction that would be hard to achieve with only local scrub. Taken together, these materials draw invisible lines across the map. Routes where obsidian moved one way and shells the other, where bitumen nodules in a reed boat ended up sealing jars in a northern house, where a copper pin in a marsh village had once been part of a trader's pack crossing a Zagros pass. We don't know the exact mechanisms. In some cases it might have been down-the-line exchange, each community giving a little and taking a little as goods moved along. In others, perhaps specialized traders or seasonal journeys bridged greater distances. But whatever the exact arrangements, the pattern is clear. Already in the Ubaid period, the Fertile Crescent was laced together by networks of exchange. And networks do more than move raw materials, they move habits. As communities across this arc traded, visited, intermarried, and perhaps shared rituals, they began to converge on certain ways of doing things. Pottery is one of the clearest markers. Ubaid-style painted ceramics appear from the south, all the way up into northern Mesopotamia and across into Susiana. Not identical everywhere, but close enough in shape and decoration that archaeologists can recognize a shared tradition. That doesn't imply a single political authority issuing orders. It suggests people watching each other, copying what they found useful or prestigious, and transmitting those designs along with the goods. The same logic applies to more abstract things: weights, measures, and standard practices. In the late Ubaid and into the periods that follow, we start to see standardized clay objects that look very much like early weights. We see recurring vessel sizes that seem tuned to particular quantities of grain or oil. We see similar architectural features: broad, tripartite houses and temple layouts, repeated over wide areas. Standardization is not just about efficiency, it is about trust. If you and I both agree what a measure of barley is, if a bead of a certain shape signals a known quantity or a known status, then trade and cooperation become easier. Misunderstandings and arguments become less frequent. You can scale up interactions beyond the face-to-face. All of this can happen without anyone sitting on a throne commanding it. When we use the word network, it's easy to picture a central hub pulling all the strings. But the archaeology of the Ubaid world suggests something more diffuse: a web, not a wheel. Small and medium-sized settlements interacting with each other, temple communities hosting gatherings, kinship ties stretching from marsh islands to highland valleys. Information flowing along many paths rather than just one. If a particular route failed, if a river channel silted up, if a village was abandoned, others could still carry the traffic. This kind of decentralized network is surprisingly resilient. It doesn't need a king to function. It doesn't leave behind proclamations in stone, but it can sustain a shared culture across hundreds of kilometers, smoothing out regional differences while allowing local variations to thrive. From the perspective of later history, this is the quiet groundwork for something more familiar. Because over time, not all nodes in the web remained equal. Some settlements sat at particularly advantageous crossroads, where river met canal, where upland routes descended to the plain, where marsh channels funneled traffic past a single mound with a conspicuous temple. Those places could start to act as hubs, drawing in surplus, craft specialists and pilgrims. Their standards of measure might become the standards. Their way of building a temple might become the model others imitate. Their elites might find ways to turn the flow of goods into a more formalized flow of obligations. The Ubaid networks show us a world where urbanism is not yet about walls and kings, but about connections, a chain of proto-urban communities loosely linked across the Fertile Crescent, sharing goods, styles, and ideas through repetition rather than command. In the next phase of the story, some of those nodal points, places like Eridu and other early centres, begin to pull more strongly on the web around them. Populations thicken, craft and ritual concentrate. The watery villages and scattered tells do not disappear, but their relationship to the emerging hub starts to change. The network is still there, but now certain strands are tightening, and the first true cities are beginning to take shape at their intersections. If you walked into one of those emerging hubs on an ordinary day, what would strike you first would not be palaces or monuments. It would be the noise, rhythmic thumps of grinding stones, the soft hiss of a potter's wheel, the clack of looms as thread slipped through warp and weft, voices calling for water, for clay, for fuel. By the later Ubaid, some houses were no longer just houses, they were workshops. Pottery is one of the clearest cases. Early on, every household probably made some of its own vessels. But as settlements grew and exchange intensified, certain families, or certain courtyards, began turning out far more than a single household could ever use. Their pots are more standardized in shape and size, more consistent in their painting, their walls thinner and more even. In some regions and phases, we see evidence for true potters' quarters, dense concentrations of misfired sherds, wasters, and kiln debris. This is not the archaeological trace of a hobby. It's a production system. People whose daily work was to turn clay and temper into containers for storing grain, oil, water, and surplus food. The same pattern appears in other crafts. Weaving leaves subtler traces, but loom weights and spindle whorls cluster in particular buildings. Textiles are rarely preserved, but when you see multiple looms in a single structure, you're probably looking at something beyond domestic cloth making. Fine, durable fabrics are not just everyday necessities. They become trade items, temple offerings, gifts that bind communities together. Beadwork and stoneworking tell a similar story. The southern alluvium has almost no good hard stone, but Ubaid sites show caches of imported materials, carnelian, lapis-like stones, marble and limestone, cut and drilled into beads, pendants and inlays. At some mounds we find concentrations of tiny drill bits, broken roughouts, and piles of discarded chips. Someone here knew exactly how to turn raw pebbles into polished symbols of status. Food itself becomes a craft. In some large Ubaid buildings, grinding stones and storage bins are not scattered, but organized. Long rows of querns, big communal ovens, installations that make more sense if grain is being milled and bread baked at scale. Perhaps for group feasts, temple distributions, or to feed labourers working on canals or platforms. All of this points to a simple but profound shift. Not everyone is doing everything anymore. The presence of craft specialists implies three things at once: surplus, training, and roles that outlast individuals. Surplus because a potter who spends most of the day at the wheel is not in the fields planting barley. Their food has to come from somewhere else. Someone's harvest is large enough and reliable enough that it can support people whose main contribution is in goods and services, rather than raw calories. Training, because standardization does not appear out of nowhere. To make the same vessel shape thousands of times, to achieve the same slip and firing results again and again, you have to learn from someone who already knows how. The bead cutter, the weaver of fine patterned cloth, the specialist in grinding grain for a temple kitchen. These are skills transmitted by apprenticeship, not by chance. And continuity, because once a village depends on a certain kind of expert, that expertise has to bridge generations. It no longer matters just who you are, but what you do. Your identity becomes entangled with a role that existed before you were born and will, ideally, exist after you die. This is where the first shadows of inequality start to appear. Archaeologists see it in house plans. On the same mound, in the same period, some buildings are broad, spacious, with multiple rooms and courtyards. Others squeeze family life into smaller, simpler layouts. Size is not a perfect proxy for wealth or power. But when you see systematic variation, bigger houses in certain quarters, more storage space in particular compounds, it suggests that some households controlled more labour, more goods, or more social connections than others. Burials tell a similar, though still muted, story. Ubaid graves are not the royal tombs of later Ur. There are no golden headdresses here, no mass sacrifices. But even in this earlier horizon, some individuals are buried with more or finer goods than their neighbours. A child interred with multiple painted vessels and a necklace of imported stone beads. An adult with a carefully made copper pin when most graves have only plain pottery, if anything. Exotic materials are a key clue. The obsidian blades, the carnelian beads, the occasional piece of copper or fine imported stone do not appear evenly across all houses or graves. They cluster. Certain households, certain lines seem to have better access to the long-distance networks that brought those goods downstream. That access is not just about wealth, it's about position in the web, being the person whose courtyard traders visit, whose family maintains ties with upland herders or coastal fishers. Still, we should be careful not to project later hierarchies backward. In the Ubaid world, we do not yet see clear kings seated on thrones, armies in neat formation, or rigid social classes carved in stone. What we see instead is gradient, a gentle slope rather than a sharp staircase. Craft specialists might live in modest houses. A family with a slightly larger home and more storage might still farm alongside their neighbours. Authority could be situational, linked to ritual knowledge in one context, to control of water in another, to craft skill or trading savvy in a third. Complexity, in other words, can grow without a single obvious pinnacle, but specialization and surplus rarely sit still. Once some people depend on others for food, and others depend on particular experts for tools, cloth, or ritual services, questions start to arise. Who makes sure the grain reaches the potters at the right time? Who decides how much flour goes into the temple bakery and how much stays with the farmers? Who allocates imported stone to different bead makers, or assigns labour to keep the canals clear? These are governance questions, even if no one yet wears a crown. The more surplus flows through certain buildings, especially temples, the more those spaces need ways to track, remember, and justify what happens inside. Clay tokens, tally marks on jars, standardized measures of grain and oil. These are early tools of management. They turn gifts and offerings into countable units. They turn vague obligations into something that can be checked. And whoever controls those tools, whoever keeps the lists in their head or in their baskets of clay counters, gains a different kind of power. Not the brute force of soldiers, but the quiet leverage of knowing who owes what and when. In the next turn of the story, that leverage crystallizes. The same temples that anchor craft workshops and food processing areas begin to act as economic engines. The same need to manage specialists and surplus pushes people toward more formal records and more explicit authority. Long before cuneiform signs pressed into tablets, the logic of accounting was already at work in these forgotten cities. Imagine standing in the cool interior of one of those early temples. Around you, thick mud brick walls, plastered and whitewashed, niches with offerings, perhaps a low platform for a cult statue, or just a carefully maintained empty space where a presence is believed to dwell. But if you look past the sacred center, into the side rooms and back corridors, you start to see something else. Storage. Rows of big clay jars sunk into the floor, bins lined with reed mats, sealed containers stacked in cramped rooms that would be miserable to live in but perfect for keeping rodents away from grain. This is where the temple begins to turn into something more than a ritual house. It becomes a redistribution center. We don't have their rule books. We don't know the prayers they spoke when they brought in the harvest. But the pattern is hard to ignore. In many Ubaid and early proto-urban sites, the largest and most centrally placed buildings, the ones with clear ritual features, also have the most elaborate storage installations. It's a plausible arrangement. Households bring in offerings, grain, oil, wool, fish, reeds, animals. Some of it is framed as a gift to the deity, some as a communal obligation, some as a way of banking surplus against bad years. The temple absorbs this flow, holds it, then lets it back out in controlled ways. Part of it goes into feasts. Every now and then the quiet storage rooms would have sprung to life, grain hauled out and ground at speed, ovens and hearths working overtime, the community gathering to eat and drink in honor of the god, or to mark seasonal rites, or to seal agreements between families and neighborhoods. Feasting is not just about calories, it is politics made edible. When a temple sponsors a feast, it shows that the god is generous, that the people who manage the god's house can take care of you, that your loyalty is rewarded in bread and beer. Another part of the stored surplus goes into labor. Temple platforms don't grow themselves. Canals don't stay clear without digging. Specialized workshops need fuel, tools, and food if they're going to keep producing. The grain in those jars can be paid out to workers who haul mud brick, dredge channels, weave cloth for offerings, carve stone for altars and votive gifts. In this way, a temple gradually becomes an engine. Not of profit in a modern sense, but of organized work. It can mobilize people and materials because it sits at the crossing point of belief, obligation, and storage. To run that engine, you need more than memory. This is where the quiet revolution of administration begins, before a single word is written. Archaeologists have found thousands of small clay objects from late prehistoric Mesopotamia and neighboring regions, cones, spheres, tetrahedrons, discs. Many are unremarkable by themselves. But when you find them in clusters, in temple precincts, near storage rooms, they start to look like something more. Counters. The mainstream interpretation, especially for the later 4th millennium, is that these were tokens used to represent quantities of goods. One cone might stand for a measure of grain, a sphere for a jar of oil, a disc for an animal. Bundle them in a little basket and you have a portable, tangible account. In some cases, these tokens are sealed inside hollow clay balls, bulli, whose surfaces are stamped or rolled with seal impressions. Break the bulla open, and you can check whether the contents match the markings on the outside. It's an early form of double entry, a way to make sure the count has not been quietly altered. Even before true bullae are common in the south, we see related habits. Storage jars with marks scratched or impressed near the rim, clay stoppers pressed into vessel mouths and then sealed, tally-like incisions on door thresholds or wall faces. None of this is yet writing. There are no clear signs that stand for words, but these are administrative tools, ways of connecting a physical container to a remembered promise. And at the heart of this toolkit is one of the most elegant social technologies ever invented, the seal. In Ubaid, and especially in late prehistoric Mesopotamia, people begin to carry carved stones, first stamp seals, then, as we move toward the Uruk period, cylinder seals. Each seal bears a unique pattern, simple motifs at first, then increasingly complex scenes with animals, human figures, and abstract designs. The mechanics are simple. A seal is pressed or rolled over wet clay that closes a jar, secures a door, or locks a basket's tie. When the clay dries, you have a fragile but visible guarantee. If someone breaks into the container, the seal impression shatters. If a door is opened, the clay has to be broken and reapplied. But the real power lies in what the seal impression means. It is a signature without letters, a way of saying, "This jar passed through my hands. This storeroom was checked by my authority. This batch of grain is under the eye of the temple, or of a particular household, or of an official acting in the god's name." In a world without passports, contracts, or ID cards, seals become portable identities. They let people recognize each other's marks across time and space. They allow trust to scale. You don't have to watch every step of the process if you trust the seal. Control follows naturally. If the right to seal containers or to unseal them is restricted to certain roles, priests, administrators, senior household heads, then those roles gain quiet power. They decide when the jar gets opened, whose debt is counted as paid, which offerings are redistributed and which are stored for the next drought. We need to be honest about the limits of our vision here. We do not have their ledgers. No clay tablet from the Ubaid tells us, "On this day, so many measures of barley were received from such and such field and allotted to these workers." The detailed accounts we associate with Mesopotamian temples belong mostly to a later age, when cuneiform is already well established. For the Ubaid and immediately post-Ubaid world, we're inferring systems from fragments, from storage rooms attached to temples, from concentrations of tokens, from ceilings broken and left in trash pits. We see the shadows of bookkeeping, not the books themselves. But taken together, those shadows point toward a clear trajectory. By the time we reach the Uruk period, around the late 4th millennium BCE, the same logic that guided tokens and ceilings becomes too heavy to manage without a more efficient medium. Counters and marks multiply. Transactions become more complex. Flows of grain, wool, oil, and labor through temple complexes intensify as settlements grow into true cities. And then, on clay tablets left to dry in the Mesopotamian sun, administration becomes visible as text. The first proto-cuneiform tablets are almost obsessively practical. List of commodities, numerals, personal names, temple accounts. They are not epic poetry yet. They are the solidification of centuries of experimentation with tokens, tallies, measures, and seals. Behind those earlier signs is a long, mostly silent history. Generations of anonymous temple stewards and household heads, counting with their fingers, their pebbles, and their little pieces of clay. A temple economy built before writing, whose logic would make writing necessary. And in the next phase of our story, that necessity explodes into something bigger. The administrative tools of forgotten Ubaid temples lay the groundwork for Uruk's vast institutional machines, and eventually for the Sumerian cities whose names still echo, even while their predecessors remain half-buried and unnamed. When those first tablets appear, they don't drop into a vacuum. They land in communities that have already been changing for centuries. From the outside, one of the clearest shifts is sheer scale. Ubaid towns and villages had already grown beyond simple hamlets, but in the late 4th millennium, some of those settlements begin to swell into something qualitatively different. More houses packed more tightly together. Whole quarters given over to craft production. Temple platforms rising higher, not just rebuilt but enlarged again and again, layered like geological strata of human intention. In the south, the site we call Uruk is where this trajectory becomes impossible to ignore. Across a few centuries, the settlement balloons to perhaps 40, 50, maybe even more thousand inhabitants, depending on which estimate you trust. We should be cautious with numbers, but everyone agrees on direction. Up, population density spikes. Open space within the walls shrinks. The city becomes a machine that has to be fed. Feeding it means intensifying everything the Ubaid world had already been experimenting with. Fields around the city are extended and subdivided. Irrigation networks become more elaborate, more interlocked, more dependent on coordinated maintenance. The old pattern of canal digging as seasonal communal work starts to look like something more continuous and organized. Inside the urban core, production scales up. Instead of 1 or 2 household kilns, you get whole zones blackened by firing. Pottery becomes more standardized, thinner, wheel-finished in bulk. Textiles move from domestic weaving to large-scale workshop output. Bevel-rim bowls, those undecorated, mass-produced clay cups, appear in staggering numbers, possibly used to distribute rations to workers. This is the point where the idea of mass labor stops being metaphor and starts leaving physical traces. Terraces, ramped platforms, monumental precincts. They all demand coordinated effort from large groups over long spans of time. Someone is organizing work crews. Someone is assigning tasks, tracking days, ensuring the right people get fed. Those someones are not acting as isolated individuals. They're acting through institutions. And this is where the Uruk period doesn't overturn the Ubaid world so much as magnify it. The temple is still central. In fact, there are more of them, not fewer. Multiple sacred precincts, each with its own storage facilities, workshops and administrative rooms, begin to share the urban space with something else. Large, non-temple buildings that may represent early palaces or other forms of secular authority. The logic of the Ubaid temple economy, offerings flowing in, rations and prestige flowing out, gets ramped up and diversified. Now there are different houses of power, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. Each has its own staff, its own seal motifs, its own archives of clay. Exchange networks too undergo the same kind of amplification. Ubaid communities already imported obsidian, fine stone, timber, and perhaps copper along long-distance routes. Under Uruk, these connections widen and thicken. Southern Mesopotamian ceramics and architectural styles appear far up the Euphrates and into the Zagros foothills. So do sealing practices and administrative habits. Scholars debate how to read this spread. Was it colonization, with southern enclaves planted like outposts? Was it trade diaspora, with merchants and craft specialists settling in foreign towns? Was it local imitation of a prestigious Uruk style? The safest answer is some of each, in different places, at different times. Cultural shifts are rarely simple. They involve movement of people, yes, but also the movement of ideas and techniques that can be adopted without full-scale migration. A northern community might copy a southern sealing system because it solves an accounting problem, not because an Uruk governor has taken over. In that light, the Uruk revolution looks less like a single dramatic break and more like an acceleration of long-running trends. Surplus, storage and redistribution were already there in the Ubaid. Uruk scales them up into something citywide. Seals and tokens were already there. Uruk concentrates them into specialized offices and archives. Canals and marshland know-how were already there. Uruk stitches them into a regional infrastructure capable of supporting multiple dense urban centers. And then, embedded within this complex comes the new medium that makes the whole thing historically visible. Writing. Those first proto-cuneiform tablets don't invent administration, but they change its memory. Before writing, obligations live in minds, in stories, in the fragile record of tokens and sealings. After writing, at least in principle, a transaction can outlast both participants. A delivery scribbled into wet clay can be checked weeks later by someone who wasn't present. A list of workers and their rations can survive a change in temple staff. This is why history, as we usually tell it, suddenly feels like it starts here. We now have names of officials, names of institutions, names of cities. We have lists of professions and commodities. a blurry, anonymous past sharpens into something that looks like a ledger. But this clarity is deceptive. When later Sumerian cities, Lagash, Nippur, appear in the written record, they arrive already mature. They already have temples, canals, workshops, city walls, complex pantheons, and legal traditions. Writing lets us see them, but it did not build them from scratch. Many of the features we casually call Sumerian may be refinements of practices that run back through Uruk into the deep Ubaid, and even earlier, temple-centered redistribution, communal canal work, marsh-based economies, neighborhood-level cooperation mixed uneasily with emerging hierarchies. At the same time, we shouldn't imagine a single unbroken cultural line. Languages change, groups move, gene pools mix, incoming herders from the steppe, farmers from neighboring regions, craft specialists following demand. All of these can fold into the urban mix over centuries. New identities emerge that are real to the people living them, even if they rest on foundations laid by others. By the time scribes begin to write in a recognizable Sumerian language, those older layers are mostly silent. They echo only in architecture styles that won't quite go away, in religious titles that no one can fully explain anymore, in administrative habits that seem obvious but had to be invented by someone long forgotten. Uruk and Sumer give us the first cities we can name. The Ubaid and its neighbours give us the first cities that made those names possible. And here we hit a strange problem. We've been talking about Ubaid people, Uruk people, pre-Sumerian communities, as if those were the labels they used for themselves. They weren't. The first texts we can actually read are already Sumerian, and they're written centuries after the heyday of the classic Ubaid villages and the earliest temple platforms. Those tablets give us city names, divine names, personal names, and eventually even ethnonyms, ways of saying us and those people over there. But they do something else at the same time. They look backward and project those names into the past. Later Sumerian scribes talk about before the flood, about early rulers, about cities that from time immemorial belong to such and such a god. They retroactively fold older layers of settlement and memory into their own story of who they are. That's not falsification, it's what human groups always do. We inherit landscapes, shrines and canals, and we write our own identities over them. For archaeologists, though, this creates a tangle. The potsherd lying in the dirt doesn't come stamped with a language. A wall foundation doesn't tell you what the people who laid its bricks called themselves. Material culture is stubbornly mute on the question of ethnonyms. You can have a very distinctive style of painted pottery, a particular way of building houses, a shared way of arranging graves, and still have no idea what language was spoken in those rooms, at those ovens, on those doorsteps. Sometimes styles and language groups do roughly track together, but it's not guaranteed. Pottery can move through trade. Building techniques can be copied between neighbours. People can switch languages over generations without changing their preferred roof shape. So when we say Ubaid culture, what we really mean is a cluster of material and architectural habits that spread across a wide area for several centuries, not the Ubaid people in the sense of a single ethnic or linguistic group that thought of itself with that label. This is why the question, were the Ubaid people Sumerians, doesn't have a neat answer. On one hand, there are arguments for continuity. The core region is the same southern alluvial plain. Many settlement mounds show long layered occupation that runs from Ubaid levels up into Uruk and then into early Sumerian levels. Temple sites like Eridu demonstrate a sustained sacred presence in one spot over a very long time. It would be odd if there weren't at least some degree of population continuity. On top of that, certain religious titles, architectural preferences and administrative habits seem to echo older patterns. The idea of a temple as an economic and ritual hub, the reliance on canals and basin irrigation, the marsh-based livelihoods that keep reappearing in southern myths and legal texts. All of these feel like deep roots. Some scholars suggest that the language we call Sumerian could have been present in the south for quite a long time before it shows up in writing, layered over earlier tongues or sharing space with them. On the other hand, there are solid reasons to be cautious. We don't have any Ubaid period inscriptions, not a single sign that we can confidently tie to a spoken language. Whatever was being spoken in those early villages is invisible to us, unless it left traces in later loanwords or place names, and those are very hard to tease apart. We also know that southern Mesopotamia was never isolated. Even in the Ubaid period, we see evidence for long-distance contacts. Over the centuries that follow, people arrive from the north, from the east, from the Arabian littoral. Herding groups and farming groups, traders and craft specialists, all filtering in and mixing. Languages can shift under those pressures. A prestige tongue associated with temple administration can spread. Local dialects can be absorbed or pushed to the margins. Ethnic identities can emerge, fade, and reconfigure, even while the irrigation canals keep running along the same alignments. So the responsible thing to say is simple and unsatisfying at the same time. The builders of the first temple platforms in the south may well be among the ancestors of the people later called Sumerians, but we cannot equate Ubaid culture with the Sumerian language community in any straightforward way. We can argue for degrees of continuity in place, in practice, in sacred geography. We cannot reconstruct their self-chosen names. Part of why they're hard to name is that the past itself keeps getting rebuilt. Southern Mesopotamia is a floodplain. It remakes its own surface. Clay dissolves, mud bricks slump, wood rots, reed mats, woven baskets, painted textiles, carved wooden cult statues, leather, thatch, all the things that filled those houses and temples are almost entirely gone. What survives best is what was least alive. Foundations, kilns, the lowest courses of walls, the burned patches where a fire baked the soil by accident. Then later people arrive and build on top. Uruk levels slice into Ubaid levels. Sumerian rebuilding cuts through both. A later temple might reuse older brick, keeping an outline of an earlier floor plan, or it might shear off the upper layers of an older platform entirely, leaving only a ghost of its footprint. Archaeology has to work through this palimpsest, scraping down from newest to oldest. It can reveal earlier phases, but each phase is incomplete, partly erased by the next. It's not a deliberate wiping of memory. It's the normal process of living in one place for thousands of years. Even our categories can mislead. We slice time into Ubaid, Uruk, early dynastic, because we need handles. But those are scholarly boxes, not lived identities. A child born in a village at the tail end of the Ubaid horizon didn't wake up thinking, I am the last of the Ubaid people. They thought of their kin, their town, their local god, maybe the nearby marsh or canal. This same layering complicates how we think about floods. Mesopotamian literature is full of them. The Sumerian king list talks about kingship descending from heaven to one city after the flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves a detailed flood story that later echoes into other traditions. People sometimes point to these texts and imagine a single cataclysmic event that wiped out an entire forgotten civilization, leaving only myth behind. The geology and archaeology paint a different, more patient picture. On a low, flat floodplain crossed by rivers that shift and swell, serious flooding is not an exception. It's a recurring feature of life. Over centuries, different cities and villages would have been hit hard at different times. Some floods would be local, others more widespread. Some settlements would recover, others might be abandoned, their mounds softened and reworked into fields. Those experiences leave physical traces. Sudden layers of silt, house floors sealed under water-laid deposits, abrupt breaks in occupation. We do see such layers at some southern sites, but not at the same date everywhere, and not at a scale that screams world-ending. So a reasonable reading is this. Real floods, many of them, over generations, shaped both the landscape and the imagination. Stories of the big flood, accreted details from different local disasters, were polished by storytellers and eventually written down in forms that suggest a single cosmic event. Memory here is not a perfect chronicle. It's a weaving together of repeated experiences into one powerful narrative thread. That doesn't prove a single lost civilization under the mud. It shows us how communities living with rivers that could suddenly turn violent tried to make sense of that danger and of the fragile continuity of their own cities. Which brings us back to the nameless builders. We may never know what words they used for themselves, or what language they argued in over irrigation ditches, or how they pronounced the names of the spirits they thanked when a harvest went well. But their absence from written history doesn't mean they're truly gone. We can still sense their decisions in the way early streets bend, in the standardized measurements of bricks, in the careful orientation of temple corners to cardinal directions. We can see their problem-solving in the layout of canals, in the placement of villages along levees and marsh edges, in the rhythm of rebuilding platforms higher and higher again. We can feel their social worlds in the clustering of houses around courtyards, in the distribution of cooking hearths and storage jars, in the spread of shared ceramic styles across hundreds of kilometers. History, as preserved in writing, forgot their names. Archaeology, working in silence under those later cities, has not. Even without a clear label, the people who first learned to coax surplus from this unstable land, who raised the earliest temples above the floodplain, who stitched scattered households into something like towns, they are still present. They're there in every later brick that follows their dimensions, in every ritual that keeps a sanctuary on the same spot, in every canal that traces an old line. Their names have dissolved in the mud. Their work has not. If we shift from the archaeologist's trench to the scribe's tablet, we find a very different way of remembering those beginnings. The Sumerian king list, compiled long after the first temple platforms at Eridu and Tel el-Weli were already ancient, opens with a simple, thunderous claim. When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. Not Uruk, not Ur, Eridu. By the time that sentence was written, Eridu was no longer the bustling hub it had once been. Political power had moved north and shifted many times. Uruk, Kish, Lagash, later Akkad and Babylon. These were the names doing the conquering, taxing and treaty-making. But in the written memory of the scribes, Eridu still held pride of place. It was not the current capital. It was the primordial one. This is where myth and geography intertwine. Sacred geography is the habit of treating certain places as more than just coordinates on a map. A city might rise and fall in economic or military importance, but its temples, its founding stories, its association with particular gods can keep it lodged in the imagination as a beginning point. Eridu, associated with the god Enki, lord of fresh water, wisdom and subterranean depths, became that kind of node. Later Sumerians knew the place was old. They could see the layered mound, the ancient temple platform, the long history of rebuilding on one spot. They walked among ruins whose deepest bricks were centuries, even millennia, older than their own houses. So in their stories, Eridu is where kingship first appears. Not necessarily in our modern sense of a bureaucratic state, but as an ordered centre of authority sanctioned by the gods. The king list strings together a sequence of pre-flood rulers with impossibly long reigns, then tells us that after the flood, kingship moves from city to city, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, as if a single divine institution is being passed like a torch. For historians, that document is not a straightforward political record. It compresses, exaggerates, and rearranges. But it does something extremely important. It curates memory. It says, here are the cities that matter in the story of how the world of walled towns and temples came to be. Here is how we, the scribal class of the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE, choose to organize deep time. Those choices are not random. Cities that sit on very old mounds, cities with long-standing cults, cities tied to important gods, get pushed back in the narrative toward the dawn of things. The sacred past reaches down through the archaeological layers, grabs a few key sites, and pulls them up into mythic prominence. That's one way that earlier realities survive population change. Even if the language shifts, even if newcomers marry in, even if elites come and go, certain places keep their ritual weight. A sanctuary might be rededicated to a different deity. A platform might be enlarged, rebuilt, faced in new brick. But the spot itself, its alignment, its relationship to water, its position in the local mental map, remains charged. Stories then flow along those lines. A later Sumerian may not have known the name of the Ubaid period priest, who first marked out a rectangle on that rise near an ancient shoreline. But they knew that, from time immemorial, that place belonged to Enki, or Inanna, or some other great power. They knew that kings of old had worshipped there, that floods had come and gone and the temple had been raised again. So when we say that Sumer forgot the people before them, we need to be careful. They forgot the details. They did not remember specific households in Ubaid period Eridu, or the sequence of rebuildings at Tel el-Weli. They had no concept of Ubaid as a distinct archaeological horizon. But they did remember that some cities were profoundly old, that some shrines were older than memory, that kingship itself had a journey through different sites before arriving in their own day. They preserved that sense of depth in myths about the flood, in king lists, in hymns that praise temples as standing since days of old. In that way, Sumer is not just a successor to earlier developments, it's an inheritor, an intensifier, and a narrator. Sumerian elites inherit infrastructures they did not build from scratch. Canal systems already carving up the plain, mounds already anchoring settlement, temple platforms already defining sacred topography. They intensify those patterns, bigger cities, denser networks, more elaborate temples, more specialized labor. But they also narrate them. They give them names, lineages, origin stories. They inscribe in clay the idea that civilization came in stages, that certain cities were chosen first, that the gods once walked in places that are now mostly dust and memory. In the middle of all this, a small pause for you. If you're enjoying drifting through these earlier layers of Mesopotamia, you might like the book that goes with this series. It's available at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a discount on the digital edition. It follows the same calm, slow unfolding approach, but with more room to wander through the evidence and the uncertainties, because uncertainty is where this story really lives. Looking before the official first chapter, the one that starts with named kings and datable tablets, doesn't mean inventing a single lost empire beneath the mud. It means accepting that there were many small beginnings, many experiments in irrigation and temple building and town life, long before anyone wrote down. When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. We can respect the Sumerian memory of a special, sacred early time, while also recognizing how myth compresses and rearranges. We can let the king list and the flood stories guide our curiosity, without treating them as literal blueprints of an erased super-civilization. Under the cities that Sumer named, under the myths Sumer cherished, there are older floors, older hearths, older canals. Their builders are quiet but not entirely lost. In the final part of this episode, we'll follow that quiet legacy down one more step, and see how much of it is still with us, hidden in the proportions of a brick, the curve of a canal, and the way a city learns over and over to rise from its own mud. If you strip away the names and the myths and look only at the patterns, the quiet legacy under Sumer's mud brick starts to come into focus. Down in those earliest layers, people are already doing the things later city dwellers will treat as simply how the world works. They are learning the habits of water, where the flood comes each year, how far it spreads, how long it lingers. They are cutting channels and ditches, first small and local, then linked in chains, so that a field a little too high or a little too far from the river can still drink. Over generations, those habits harden into expectations. Of course, you maintain the canal together. Of course, you clear the silt, patch the banks, negotiate who diverts water when. They're gathering to build on raised spots, hauling basket after basket of mud brick to shore up a mound that floods a little less than the plain around it. They rebuild when the walls slump, when the platform erodes, when the old shrine leans. Sometimes they change the layout a little. Sometimes they lay a new floor directly on top of the old. Layer after layer, they're teaching the land the shape of a town. They're weaving themselves into networks they can't quite see, but which hold them all the same. A fishing village on the marsh edge brings reeds and bitumen. A farming hamlet upriver sends barley and wool. A settlement at a natural crossing point becomes the place where someone crafts a little better than their neighbours. Finer pots, better blades, more regular bricks. Specialisation creeps in without fanfare. The person who is good at straight walls gets asked to help more often. The person who knows when the river will turn salty, who can read the water for hints of an early flood, is listened to more closely. Over time, those differences in skill and trust become differences in status, in storage, in whose house needs thicker foundations. From our distance, we can summarize all this in a sentence. Pre-Sumerian communities lay the foundations of irrigation, communal building, regional networks, and early specialization. But on the ground, it was just countless ordinary days, hauling, digging, arguing, repairing. A mother teaching a child how deep to plant seed in soil that has just drained. A group of neighbours deciding whether this year they finally extend the canal another 100 metres. The strangest part is how much remains invisible. We can see the canal cuts, but not the words people used for them. Later, Sumerian gives us id, puratu, aplu, and a vocabulary of water and work. Before that, we don't know what people called the rivers that sustained them, or the ditches that failed and had to be dug again. We do not know what they called themselves, or what distinctions they made between us and the people in the next marsh over. We can chart the general pathway from village to town to city-state. More people, more storage, more walls, more specialized buildings, but the exact routes are blurry. Did authority rise first from temple households that managed grain and offerings, or from lineages that controlled key canal junctions? Did some communities leap quickly towards centralization, while others stayed loose and village-like for centuries? The mainstream archaeological picture gives us broad trends. The fine grain of identity, language, and decision-making is still mostly lost in the mud. And yet the systems those unknown people built are the same ones later Sumerian scribes take for granted. When a text casually mentions labourers assigned to dredge a canal, that only makes sense in a landscape where centuries of prior digging have already carved the river into something humans can manage. When a hymn praises a temple raised upon an ancient platform, it leans on a tradition of communal building that stretches back into obeyed layers no one remembers by name. The miracle is not a single genius inventor or a single first city. It is the accumulation of small solutions. One more field tied into the water network, one more workshop clustering near a shrine, one more generation deciding that this mound, this alignment, this neighbourhood is worth rebuilding again. Under every famous name, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, there are anonymous predecessors, people who never appear in any king list, but who still shaped canals, baked bricks, divided tasks, and slowly turned a floodplain into a web of managed water and enduring mounds. When we say history forgot them, we really mean that written history started late. The clay tablets arrive after the long experiment has already worked. By then, the rhythms of irrigation, the expectation of communal labour, the presence of craft specialists, the habit of gathering offerings at a platformed building in the town's heart, all of it feels natural to the people doing it. It wasn't natural, it was built, piece by piece, life by life. As you drift off, you might imagine one of those lives. Not a king or a priest, just someone carrying mud in the heat, or steering a reed boat through a narrow channel, or tracing the lines for a new wall on ground that has held walls before, not knowing that 6,000 years later, people far away would be whispering about them in the dark, trying to reconstruct their world from broken sherds and buried bricks. If you've enjoyed wandering through these quieter layers beneath the famous cities, you might also like the book that goes with this series. It explores more of these prehistoric secrets in the same calm, slow way. You can read more about it and pick up a copy if you'd like at sleepytimehistory.com. And if this kind of gentle, deep time helps you relax, it really does help the channel when you tap like, subscribe, and leave a comment.